In the previous video, we covered the history of psychology from its roots in philosophy to the pre-World War II period. In this video, we'll cover the history of psychology since World War II. But, to understand post-war psychology, we first must go back to the 1920s. During the 1920s, a school of thought arose within Germany known as Gestalt psychology. The word Gestalt roughly translates as whole, and their approach was to study human perception and experience as a whole rather than trying to break it down into component parts as the structuralists had done. So for example, in this image you probably perceive a white upside-down triangle. No triangle is fully drawn, yet we assemble the various clues to perceive a meaningful whole. This is the kind of thing that interested the Gestalt psychologists. However, many of these psychologists faced a serious problem. Some were of Jewish descent or faith, in a culture where Adolf Hitler ultimately would come to marginalize and order the systemic murder of German Jews. Others were not themselves Jewish, but objected to Hitler's treatment of their Jewish colleagues and friends. As Hitler's regime turned its population against these people, several Gestalt psychologists left Germany and sought exile in the United States. Max Wertheimer came to work at the New School for Social Research, Kurt Kafka at Smith College, and Wolfgang Köhler at Swarthmore College. So, jumping back to the 1950s, a young psychology student by the name of Ulrich Neisser took up graduate study at Swarthmore. Studying under Köhler and his assistant Hans Wallach, another émigré from Nazi Germany, Neisser came to decide that internal mental states could be studied using scientific methods, an approach he would come to advocate as the field of cognitive psychology. Over time, cognitive psychology would come to supplement behaviorism as a dominant approach to scientific psychology. As the science of psychology was undergoing a challenge to its dominant behaviorist model, so too was the case with the practice of psychology. Some psychologists had become dissatisfied with Freudian psychology as the dominant approach to psychotherapy, declaring it to be too dark and judgmental about human nature. They preferred a model that was more optimistic, an approach that looked more at people's potential in the future than at their failings of the past. These humanistic psychologists, people like Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, were the first real challengers to the Freudian model, and over time their approach to the client within therapy came to displace Freudianism from its dominance of the practice of psychology. As we get into the 1960s, we see further important developments. Feminist psychologists, such as Carol Gilligan, would make the valid criticism that the field was too dominated by men and a masculine perspective, and they would work to introduce a broader, more inclusive approach. Sociocultural psychologists would point out that too much of the research in psychology studied only Western populations, and would advocate for an approach that was more culturally inclusive. The field has not always acted on their perspectives. Too much research continues to be conducted only on Western college students, but they made important points that resonate to this day. However, the most major shift in the field of psychology came in the 1970s and 80s, with the development of new technology that would allow us to observe the structure and activity of the living human brain. Prior to this period, if you wanted to connect brain and behavior, to try to solve Descartes' mind-body problem, you mostly had to find people who were abnormal, wait for them to die, and then cut up their brain to see how it was different. However, with the invention of these new tools, we could now look at the brain structure or brain activity of people while they were still alive, and we could have them engage in behaviors within brain scanners to see how these affected brain activity. This field of neuroscience grew during the last 35 years into a dominant approach within psychology. Some would argue too dominant. The tools, for all their sophistication, remain relatively coarse in terms of what they can tell us about human nature at the level of the brain, and many works of popular neuroscience tend to overstate the extent to which narrowly structured neuroscience studies can be generalized to sophisticated human behaviors. Nonetheless, this is a fundamental part of where the field is right now and where it will be headed in the future. So where does that leave us? Ultimately, psychology is different things to different people. The research world has cognitive psychologists, behaviorists, neuroscientists, and many others. The world of practice includes a variety of perspectives, from people still influenced by Freud to humanists and practitioners of cognitive and behavioral methods. The field has come a long way, and yet it remains a very young science. We still cannot answer fundamental questions like the mind-body problem, but every day thousands of people around the world are working to advance our understanding of the field of psychology.